Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is Kyle from Reefs and Reactions. Today I'm going to dive into the 6-month update on my Walstad method tank. I set this up approximately July, early August last year, so we're coming up about 6 months, maybe a little bit over. But nonetheless, gone through a lot of changes, and I think that an update on 6 months would be really helpful for a lot of people to see what I did right, what I did wrong, and everything I've learned. For those that are new here, the Walstad method is a method of freshwater aquariums that try to mimic what we find in nature, in ponds and lakes, and replicating that inside of our aquarium. So instead of relying on expensive equipment like CO2 and regulators and expensive lighting, we try to minimize this and recreate stuff that we would find naturally. In this method, use a more natural, nutrient-rich soil, something organic that you would find at a big box store or a local hardware store. And you don't need manicured substrates, like stuff that you see typically on YouTube that are expensive substrates that you'd use inside your tanks. You use something a lot more simple, like organic potting soil. And because of these, I was drawn to this method, learned more about it online, watched some YouTube videos, and thought that this was a great, inexpensive way to replicate a lot of things I would see online. So rewinding back to when I first set this up, and I apologize ahead of time because I don't have any footage of this. I have a couple pictures that'll pop up there, but this is before I started my YouTube channel. But I do have a full video on the Walstad method setup and ideology behind it. I'll link that up here, and soon I'll be putting out a video on setting up a small desktop sized aquarium based on the Walstad method. So if that interests you, make sure to subscribe and keep an eye out for that video coming soon. Nevertheless, like I talked about, I started out with a good quality organic potting soil that I found at Home Depot. In the Walstad method video that I talked about earlier, I put a couple up there, and feel free to take a look for yourself online and what people recommend for your local big box stores. But I layered this soil at the bottom about an inch thick, and then on top of this I put on another layer of gravel. This gravel layer was approximately twice or 3 times thicker than that, so 2 to 3 inches, and this just helps compact down the soil and helps keep any of that loose leaf, loose litter, wood, or anything that's in the organic soil from floating to the top and stirring up inside of the aquarium. Then once those were in there, I built up my hardscape, constructed it the way I wanted to look, set up all the tubing and anything that I needed inside of the tank, and then planted my plants. Again, the Walstad video goes through exactly which plants I have. Take a look at that for in-depth, but there's a good mixture of floating, hardy stem plants and some more foreground decorative style plants. And adding a good mixture of these, ones that take root after a while and ones that grow extremely quickly, kind of helps kickstart and increase the longevity of these Walstad method tanks. All in all, this is a great method for low-tech tanks and requires minimal equipment. You don't need any expensive lights or CO2 or any other type of technology built into it that you see a lot of the fancier tanks set up with, and that's exactly what I wanted, and the Walstad method so far has been great to me. As such, looking back, there were several big wins in my first Walstad method tank over the last 6 months. The natural setup was great in that it kickstarted the cycle pretty quickly, especially when adding some of the nitrobacter or quick bacteria into the system and kickstarting the nitrogen cycle. Once that was up and running, I was a little bit worried. Sometimes you get a spike in the ammonia and nitrates from the soil that you put into the tank, but the soil, again, although it was cheap, it was high quality, and I didn't have any initial spikes, and I didn't have any die-offs of my invertebrates, vertebrates, or my plants in the beginning. And because the plants were so fast growing, I didn't have any algal blooms. I had a little bit of green hair algae for what felt like maybe a week or less, but because the plants were so fast growing, it took over all those nitrates and just outcompeted the algae. And after that initial algae bloom, I think about a month in or so, and only lasting a week or less, I really didn't have any other algae after that. Once in a while, some algae would appear on a rock or on the glass, but really it's a simple scrape off or just left it, and eventually the snails got to that and didn't have any problems with it. And like I said, I try to keep this on a budget, so I wasn't looking at any expensive lights that you can find for freshwater tanks, stuff ranging up $100 or $200. is just a little ridiculous for lights, especially with the technology that has been implemented in LED lights over the last 5 or 10 years. So for this tank, I went with Sansi. And then I have the bulb here. You can see there's multiple LEDs throughout the side of it. I've been using this over the last 6 months. I've been using Sansi light bulbs for several years now, and I can highly recommend all of the light bulb products. So even before YouTube, I was using Sansi light bulbs, and I feel very lucky because they actually reached out to me after my Soltech dupe light track that I have right up here and offered me a 10% discount code that I can use for the channel. That's a link down in the description. So if you want to check out any of the products, they typically have a lot of discounts going on, and this 10% off actually applies on top of that. So you get further 10% off. Highly recommend them and really appreciative for them for supporting the channel. So that light, as you can see, is just built into a lamp that we had. And I think it looks a little bit better, a little bit more natural, not as jarring inside of living room, especially when you're trying to keep things cozy. That lamp is then plugged into a smart plug. The smart plug is on a timer, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, 4 hours on. This is recommended through the Walstad method, and I've had really good success for it. One, it works because of the CO2 cycling in the system. Your plant's eating up CO2 and the light's on, so that 4-hour midday break or siesta helps CO2 from the atmosphere re-enter into your aquarium water, and then the light turns back on and the plants can start eating it up again. This cycle is also nice because a lot of times I get to see it in the morning before I head off to work or before I go out there on my day. The light will then turn off for a couple of hours and then basically turns on right as I'm getting home again, and I get to enjoy that again for a couple hours while I'm home. So with the light and with the cycle that I'm running, the 444 cycle, I've had great success with both the terrestrial plant that I have in my tank and all of the aquatic and floating plants that I had, which leads me to the other pro and somewhat of a con is the maintenance. It's been really low-key maintenance because it is naturally cycling and the plants and animals are harmonized inside of the tank. So I do very minimal water changes. I do maybe once or twice every couple months, very, very minimal. Keep the glass clean inside the tank, but again, the algae typically stays off it with the snails and the freshwater limpets that are in it. Actually keep it pretty clean. I feed the fish and the shrimp that are in there a couple pellets a week. And really the bad part of it, if you want to say it's bad, is I have to do a lot of trimming because the plants grow so fast and grow so large that often they get to the top of the water and then start to hang out on the surface. So everything below them starts to die off and melt. So you just have to stay on top of that because it kind of looks a little unsightly when you get to that point and you have to retrim it back down to the base layer and wait for it to grow back up. So I just recommend staying on top of your maintenance because the Walstad method can introduce some really fast growing plants. Lastly, I get a lot of comments about this. The tank does have a filter. This was revised from what Diana Walstad had initially said, and it was revised in her book that she does recommend a small filter or a filter that doesn't really have any mesh or anything inside of it. My filter is just a cheap filter off of Amazon. It has the largest mesh filters you have in there, so I guess it is performing some type of filtration, but just on very large particulates. If anything gets sucked in there like a leaf or a floating stick, then it would catch onto that, but it's not doing any fine filtration, so none of the small particulates are getting stuck inside the canister. I've had to pull this canister apart once or twice just because sometimes stuff does get clogged in there, and you just have to basically recycle it back through the tube, and it flows fine. Essentially, the only reason I'm using this is just for aeration to get oxygen into the water and for movement to keep the whole tank at the same temperature. And again, this is recommended by Diana Walstad, so no hates in the comments. I get a lot of questions about it. It is recommended by her, and even if it wasn't recommended by her, I would still follow through with all the Walstad methods. I would still use a filter because I think it adds so much, especially inside the filter. A cool, dark place is fantastic for nitrifying bacteria, and that's the beauty of the Walstad method. Once you set it up, nature takes over and you have to do very minimal maintenance, and you just sit back and relax and enjoy the beautiful piece of art that you created inside an aquarium. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There's a couple issues that came up during the last 6 months of setting it up. One of the biggest hurdles was just the plants overall. One, cheaping out a little bit and trying to get some plants off of Etsy, ordering them this way with people that don't have the greatest reviews. a lot of plants melt over their shipping, especially if they get delayed a couple days or are sent incorrectly. So a little bit of money was lost on that. And then there's a couple plants I wanted but just didn't make it during the shipping process. So if you order online, go with someone reputable, either a bigger company or someone on Etsy that you've ordered from before or you see really good reviews on. And like I said, because the plants did grow so fast, you did see melting back because the lower leaves, especially on the Pogostemum erectus, the leaves are so thin, and the rotundifolia grew so much faster than it would cover the surface, and then you have issues of the lower leaves on the Pogostemum just not growing and melting off and just looking like a bare stick in there, which isn't very nice to see. Likewise, be careful with what floating plants you pick, and make sure there aren't any hitchhikers with those. I had some duckweed come along with mine when I ordered some red root floaters, and the duckweed just took over, and I spent multiple hours over a couple of weeks just trying to pick out every last piece because it just takes over so fast. It grows so rapidly, gets caught up in all your filters, gets caught up in all the other plants. So just be careful with those. But likewise, if they grow too much, then you get shading of the bottom plants, and then you run into the same issues where stuff starts to die off more quickly than it should in the system, and the system can't keep up with the dying off. And another thing deals with the fog machine that I have inside the tank and how I set it up previously. The fog machine is cool. It goes off several times during the day. I think it helps keep some of the humidity up for the plants that are above the water, but I think these are much better suited in more paludarium style tanks where you have higher walls, or inside of full enclosure style tanks where you do have the full vivarium style aquarium. The humidity does probably increase a little bit locally, but because it's not enclosed and it's not high walls, it doesn't really stick around for too long. And as soon as it turns off, all the fog just, whispers away. And with the fog machine, you basically have the fog machine just barely underwater, and you put a little cap on top of that because it just shoots up water, and you don't want to go spraying all over your table, your wall, or what have you. And to make that look a little better, I painted it black, which looked fine, but I thought it would be cool and go the extra mile and put some live moss on top of it that I just collected locally outside. Looked great for probably 2 weeks, and then it was in the back, so I didn't really pay attention to it. And then a couple more weeks passed, and then a couple more, and then basically it was just composting on top of my fog machine and turning moldy and gross. So I probably wouldn't do that again. I don't think I would get the fog machine again. I like that it's in there now, but I'm not sure if I would spend the extra $50 or so on that. But again, if you have more vivarium or full paludarium style tank, I think the fog machine is a fantastic addition to that, especially when you have more hanging plants and more moss inside the tank that can benefit from the added atomization of water and increased humidity. And lastly, again, towards the maintenance, I would just recommend staying on top of the maintenance. Doing water changes here and there is still beneficial. I should be doing more water changes than I am right now, and that kind of helps you just stay on top with the cutting back of plants like I talked about. I think if you stay on top of that, which I guess proves just how well this method works, because you do have to do a lot of plant cutting back maintenance, but again, stay on top of that and it'll stay looking really, really nice for a long time. So with my successes and somewhat failures over the last 6 months, these combined, what did I actually learn about the Walstad method and how do I feel about it now? The first thing I learned is just patience. The Walstad method isn't meant to be a quick fix, and some of those videos that you can see on YouTube where people set up the tank, within 2 or 3 weeks, it just looks super overgrown, beautiful. This is because, again, they have the expensive equipment like CO2 dosing, and it's just not really realistic for a lot of people because of budgetary constraints. But over time, the Walstad method does fill in. And as I'll show with some pictures right now, you can see that it starts off pretty bare, but even after a couple weeks or a couple months, it starts to fill in. And then you kind of hit this asymptote where you just want to cut it back just enough to stay at that lush look. If you want it to be overgrown, you can let it go. And I think just pick your plants a little bit more carefully. But once you get to this point, you just have to do simple maintenance once or twice a month, and the tank will be looking beautiful, and your fish, shrimp, whatever you have in there, you're just going to love it because it does mimic nature so perfectly. And the other thing is lighting. Really try to tune in your lighting. Make sure you're getting enough. I think there's a lot of mixed sources out there. I think if you have terrestrial plants, You'd probably want a light that's a little bit stronger, but a little bit more high up so you don't burn the leaves on those plants, or introduce plants that have a higher bar and can take a little bit more of that extended light directly on their leaves. But if you don't have any terrestrial plants, you go straight in the water, I think a setup just like mine is really good. Get a nice bulb that's probably 30 or 40 watts, set it on a timer, preferably in the Diana Walstad suggests the 4 hours on, 4 hours off, 4 hours on, and just keep an eye on it. If you think that the plants are wilting too quickly, or that you notice the plants are being overgrown a little too much, you can adjust that lighting schedule or try a different bulb or height from the bulb to tank, and just play around with that, because the lighting is really important in these setups. So even with a little bit of a learning curve, I think it's completely manageable for anybody that has had a tank before. And for beginners, I think it's a great way to experiment. You don't have to add fish or shrimp or anything into your system. You can just start out with a plant-based system, keep an eye on it, learn the ins and outs. Then after a couple months, if you feel comfortable, you can introduce vertebrates and invertebrates at the time. And the eventual payoff is a beautiful system that mimics nature. Setting up my first Walstad method tank was certainly a path that had a lot of trial and error in it, but I don't think I'd change anything if I went back and tried it again. It taught me a lot about just the natural processes and to not overcomplicate things. Keep it simple. Just try to mimic what nature has been doing for tens of thousands of millions of years. If you're thinking about a low-tech approach, I think you should try this. Take this as your initiative to just go for it. Watch other videos and just try it out yourself. You can start on small scale as well. You don't need 7 gallons. You don't need 50 gallons. You can start with 1 or even 5 gallons and just let it go on your, small table that you have in your living room, or on your desk that you have in your office. And I hope my experience in talking about it give you a little bit of insight into what to expect and some things just to look out for. So I think I'll wrap it up there. If you've tried the Walstad method and found similar results to me, or maybe had different experiences, leave them down in the comments below. I'd love to hear about it. If you're new to this and have any questions about it, drop those down below. I'll try to answer them, but the community is pretty good with talking about these as well. I'm sure all of us would love to help you and, find your initial footsteps in this new journey. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, write a comment. I really appreciate the feedback and just trying to continually improve the channel. Make sure to subscribe for some more laid-back discussions and a couple of builds coming soon. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep curious. Peace. Bye.